So today I'm going to do two presentations, and there are some handouts, if you like, or things that I will be referring to in today's event that you can download from my website, which is simply www.soulspark.online. And there, actually, you may have a little bit of trouble. Let me just check how you're going to find, when you get onto my website, how you find the information. Sorry about this. I was working at this last night, but I know I forgot to do something to make it most easy. So I will fix that in the course of today. But if you go onto my website, there's a I'll tell you what, I'll explain how to get it a little later. And I'll just press on with the content at this point. There's nothing in what I'll say in this first session that depends on access to that, and I'll fix that later. So let me do a little bit of introduction to today. I think one of the things that I want to say about doing something like this is that as a presenter of stuff around the Ministry of Spiritual Accompaniment, it is one of those challenges I find that when I present something, it kind of sounds as if I've got it sussed. And the reality is, from my point of view, that the stuff of this presentation remains a challenge to me, in that I still seek to do this better rather than I've got it worked out and I know exactly how to deal with this at every instance. But one of the gifts of being given opportunities to present like this is that in thinking further and deeper to make a presentation, it challenges me and helps sharpen me up. And so I find this quite a gift in terms of helping me develop and continue to develop as a spiritual accompanier. I find also the conversation around what goes on in these presentations deeply stimulating and helpful in the ongoing thinking and reflecting and exploring better practice in this extraordinary and important ministry of spiritual accompaniment. So I come as a fellow practitioner today to work with you to explore how it is we find ourselves both encouraged and challenged in our ministry to enable encounter with God. A word about God, just as we get going, and the way I use the term God, because in my book, any word for God, including the word God, is inadequate. And there are many words we have that may be referring to God. In our English heritage and language, we have a history of gendering God with the pronouns like him and his and so on. And I seek today, as most of the time, to avoid engendering God with those sorts of terms, because I have just a consciousness that whatever we use to describe God, God is bigger than the concept we might have in our minds, bigger than any experiences of God we may have. There's always more. And yet God is also deeply intimate with us all. That I have this sense, which from time to time I'm more aware of than at other times, of God being closer to me than my flesh and bones, that my thoughts, my feelings and everything, God is deeply, intimately involved in it all, and yet is more. And there is this extraordinary mystical mystery of God's presence that is both deeply within and deeply beyond us. And it's that mystery of God that is what we term in Trinitarian terms the sense of the creative spark in life, the incarnate presence in life, and the breath and energizing of life, all of which are aspects of our experience and non-experience of God. So to think around how we enable encounter, I want to dig a little deeper today, and particularly thinking about our personal experience. A little while ago, I was part of some ongoing training for spiritual accompaniers, and in a Zoom triad, I was accompanying someone who I'm going to call Jane. I found myself listening to her and to a load of stuff that she was bringing that seemed to me to need a counselor rather than a spiritual accompanier. And as she got into this stuff, I was finding myself somewhat bored and somewhat irritated. She was expressing quite a lot of inner angst that was all about what was wrong with her daughter's life and how could she sort her daughter out. You know, as I was saying, I found myself not very comfortable with all of this. And within myself, I was praying, God, how do I bring awareness of your love here, or just of you here, when all her attention is placed on her and her daughter? The focus is so centered on herself in her experience of her daughter. I found myself asking her this, or saying this to her: can I invite you to picture your daughter and her life as it is at the moment, and to see where God is for her, and to see how God is present to her. And immediately, having said that, I found myself thinking, I wonder if I've put the focus in the wrong place, because this is still about the daughter and not about Jane. It wasn't a disastrous intervention. And I noticed, and the observer in the triad noticed, that the tone of the conversation changed significantly following that. We ended up in a very different sort of place. And actually, without prompting from me, Jane came to recognize that it was her lack of trust in God that was the root of her anxiety and her discomfort about her daughter. So I witnessed a little bit of a moment where the shift happened between a focus, as it were, centered on her human relationship with her daughter, shifting to her spiritual relationship with God. It is a little example. of how in this ministry we might be wittingly or unwittingly agents of that sort of transition, that sort of shift into a personal experience. As we reflected in the triad afterwards, and what had happened in all of that, it was so interesting to notice how we were all aware that I could have gone in all sorts of other directions with what was being presented. I could have picked up on her processing her emotions or the psychological stuff. There were so many different ways we could have explored what was being presented. And I have, in my own experience as an accompanier, been aware of many times where I've not gone in that sort of direction. Something in me has kind of avoided it. And we've gone down the path of the psychological or emotional. We've gone down the path of problem solving and so on. But there is something about that point at which I was about to make some sort of response. There's something there about that being a threshold point, a moment where we are either going to dive in to engage in some deeper way, or we might actually step back from the deeper engagement to something a little safer, to something a little easier, something where we might feel a little more competent, and so on. Thresholds are points of transition, as it were, points of choice, whether to transition or not, whether to go in, pull back. One of my favorite books on the ministry of spiritual direction is Barry and Connolly's The Practice of Spiritual Direction. And they write in that this: if spiritual directors do not focus on the religious experience of their directees, then this most intimate and challenging area of experience will ordinarily be skirted in their conversations. Other areas of life experience, and especially problem areas, will take up the time. Directees may get help with these areas, but they may not develop a deeper personal relationship with their Lord. And that, I think, describes the hub, the nub of the challenge and the invitation. The Jesuit Rob Marsh, who once was based at Loyola Hall but is now in Oxford, wrote in The Way journal several years ago an article which was entitled "Teaching Spiritual Direction as if God were real." It's a wonderfully provocative title that I found both speaking to me and challenging me as I read it. And Rob, in that article, tells of his own experience of being in spiritual direction and being invited by his spiritual director to this threshold of really a kind of being conscious of how, in the now of his time in spiritual direction, he could be more aware of the presence of God and the dynamic of his relationship with God in that moment. He writes, "I found that though my directees," so, and then he follows that with pursuing that in his own spiritual direction and writes out of that experience. I found, though, that my directees often initially balked, as I had, at believing God might be real and really available in their own sense of, in their own experience of prayer. And that sense that he discovered this threshold was one that, while there was this, do I dive in, do I pull back, both in him, in his experience, but also in directees in their experience, that diving in could make something much more real than they had expected or anticipated. So there's this sense here that we, in our accompanying of people, we can find ourselves again and again on this threshold, and that we as directors are agents in enabling that threshold to be managed or handled, responded to, if you like, and we will be conscious of the directees being on that threshold and, as it were, having an option as to whether they go and dive in or not. One of the artists who I found speaking to me in terms of my own personal journey of faith and journey with God is the artist Sigur Koda. I guess he's fairly familiar to many of you. Fabulous depictor of scenes from scripture, particularly the Gospels, and depictor of encounters with Jesus. And his depiction of Jesus washing the disciples' feet is one that's been around in my awareness and my journey for many years. And it shows Jesus washing Peter's feet. And one of the wonderful things about the way he depicts Jesus is that you never see Jesus' face in his art, but you see his face reflected in the water at Peter's feet. But what Koda so powerfully articulates in much of his art is the human experience of encountering Jesus. And we look at Peter here and his face, which seems slightly confused, slightly puzzled, unsure. But that is explicitly articulated even more powerfully by his hands. We see both of Peter's hands. We see his left hand raised as if to push Jesus away. You're not going to wash my feet. And his right hand pulling Jesus closer. Wash all of me. And he depicts this extraordinary inner human reality of being conflicted in our desires, between the desire that is kind of the self-centered, self-conscious centered, I can't have him serving me, to the deep desire of everything that Jesus can offer. Everything, wash the whole of me, and pulling it. So the hands show a pull and a push, contrary. And in my experience, this is where we as human beings live, in the confliction of those desires. And in accompanying people, and certainly in my experience of being accompanied by spiritual directors, I know I find myself sitting on that threshold. And it's, will I, won't I, can I, can't I, do I, don't I, the threshold of kind of teetering on that before moving and letting go, either to dive in or at times to pull back. There's a sense in which I'm on that threshold every time I come to prayer, every time I sit with someone else for spiritual direction, every time I go on retreat. I know I have at least 24 hours, if not 36 or 72, kind of sitting on that. Do I really dive into this retreat and let myself be immersed or not? And I have to find a freedom. I have to find an energy that takes me in, or I have to be found by that energy. It's probably a better way of putting it. It's a privileged position when I sit with others and watch them on that threshold, seeking to not close the possibility of diving in, seeking to gently keep it open and not push them into the water. But all the time open to the possibility of them drawing closer to Jesus, to God, to the Spirit, or letting that happen to them. So this threshold of drawing closer or pulling away is, it seems to me, the nature of the human condition that is accentuated sharply at points where the intention might be to encounter God. As a spiritual accompanier, I find myself again and again drawing upon the model of spiritual direction that kind of works with a triangle, where we have in the encounter, if you like, three persons. We have the accompanier or director, the pilgrim or directee, sitting in the same room or on the same Zoom conversation as we do it more often than not at the moment, in relationship. But of course, there is the presence of God, who is in some sort of relationship with the pilgrim, and of course, in some sort of relationship with me, the accompanier or director. But the focus of my attention as I sit as a spiritual director is not directly, as it were, on the pilgrim, but it's on their relationship with God. My focus is centered somewhere. I mean, the models are always difficult because they kind of have limitations, but it's focused on that dynamic that is going on between the pilgrim and God. It can look as if God is away and up and distant. It doesn't mean that at all, because in the most part, the sense is of the presence of God deep within, in some hidden way, and yet tangible. And I am there with the intention of helping that dynamic relationship to be noticed, to be responded to be developed. And so that sense of the focus of attention not being on all the stuff that the pilgrim might be bringing, but actually on what that stuff has to show about their relationship with God and where that might go. Yesterday, I was talking to someone who was seeking a spiritual director, a clergyman in this diocese who will remain nameless, who I'd said to him, so what's the stuff that you would kind of feel you would need to be bringing to spiritual direction if you had someone tomorrow? And it was all about the stuff of his ministry. It was all about, how do I do this? How could I do this better? How could I manage my time? And I said, so how would you react if the spiritual director said to you, what's happening to you in your prayer in response to those sorts of issues? Would you see that as a distraction, or would you see that as a helpful response? And he had to think for a few minutes about that. And I hope it helped him realize what I find so many clergy like myself can do in spiritual direction, which is bring the stuff of the work as all that needs to be worked with, rather than the stuff of my encounter with God. And this model helps kind of sharpen, it seems to me, that distinction. So we're looking as an accompanier at the relationship. We're looking at what might help this encounter that is going on be kind of more, what can deepen it. And it's there that the heart of the ministry of spiritual direction lies in my book. And therefore, we are constantly working with the threshold. We are there, present to the dynamic and the potential of where that might go into the more, into the greater, for each and every individual. So that's what I wanted to share in this time, and to invite you to do some reflection for yourself, to think about your own experience of God, your own encounters with God in your journey. And so some points for pondering here. Identify an encounter and spend some time just noticing again the dynamic of it all. What actually happened? Were there threshold points as that encounter was being moved towards? Were there points of decision, of kind of nudge, of the sense of, well, I might go there, I might not? So to notice your own experience of the thresholds. And notice in that threshold point what the stuff within you was that was drawing you into the encounter. And what were the impulses within you that were pulling you away from that? But reflect on the fruit of what happened. What was the outcome? What impact did going with it into the encounter have upon you? How did it change your life? Putting it in big terms. But also to reflect in your experience of accompanying others when you've been the witness or the enabler of someone else's encounter with God. With the same questions: what happened? Were you aware of what the dynamics of the threshold were? What the draws were, what the impulses to withdraw were, what the fruit was? And the invitation to ponder that, and to see what emerges for you. So we're going to take a break in a minute, but I'm happy to take a couple of responses, questions, anything that needs a little bit of clarification before we head into that time for your reflection. So if you want to wave your hand or use the raise hand option on the screen, I will call you in and we can hear what you want to say. Anyone? Roger, if you unmute yourself.
I just felt a little uncomfortable with the phrase diving in. It sounds, it could sound a bit kind of insensitive, kind of blundering in, and you know, stop telling me all about your problems. You know, the answer is God. So yeah,
just thank you. Yeah, I mean, diving in is not perhaps the best term, and I certainly, as an accompanier, wouldn't want to kind of advocate any of that sort of, you know, really getting your hands stuck in on but at the same time, I think sometimes accompanying, there is a sense of this question or this, you know, next intervention feels thresholdy and I'm taking a risk in doing it. And it's kind of diving in that sense, I suppose, that I might like the term. But yeah, care. I mean, this needs delicate work when you're one-to-one with someone. This is not you know, a muscular and a kind of controlling sort of thing at all. So thanks for highlighting that. Anyone else want to comment or question? Or in which case, take a break, get a bit of away from screen time. I will leave this slide with the questions on the screen so that you can refer to it just to prompt your own reflections. But it's now nearly 20 past 10. The break is through until 11:15, at which point we'll regather and John will take us into some breakout groups where we can share on the reflections that have emerged from this time. So we've got a break now till 11:45, 10:45, regather and move into groups following that. So yeah, feel free to turn your video off. You've got yourself on mute anyway. Just go with it, make yourself a cup of coffee, ponder, mull over these points and think about your own experience of encounter with God and your experience of being a witness or an enabler of encounter. And I'll see you in half an hour. Okay.